Story begins with a dragon, which are the strongest creatures in the world. They are also frightening to everyone. Treat dragons as if they were gods. Offer sacrifices to them. Certain place in the world, some dragons were flying around. Soon after, we go to a boy who had finished making a scarf. Excited, he jumps on top of the scarf. Excited, he even wonders if his parents would like it. Someone ends up catching his attention. A dragon asking where the boy was. Our protagonist, whose name is Norn, runs, apologizing. Then he wonders if training would start today. Father was one of the strongest dragons in the world, along with his mother. Two dragons then smile, for it was clear that the training would take place. Two of the strongest dragons in the world, and our protagonist, Norn, was a sacrifice. Dragons fly, catching the protagonist's attention, asking how many years it had been since he came to the island. Today would make 12 years that he had been there. Father said it was time to start the situation. Then he knocks down the protagonist, because he has a mission. Starting tomorrow, he will live alone in the human world. Frightened, our protagonist wonders what this would be. Soon, realizing the situation, it was impossible for him. For not even he had left that island, but he was still falling into the human world. Into all the blows he had learned previously, nothing worked. So, he did not learn the dragon's magic language. Still, he was falling from the clouds, wondering how he would survive in that world. Then, he falls to the ground with everything, creating a small explosion. After the smoke cleared, he ends up getting up, realizing that humans were strong enough to hurt even dragons. He asks his father if he could stay on the island for a while longer. Father answered, no. His father's scream, which had already destroyed a piece of the mountain where the protagonist fell. Frightened, he decides to just accept the situation. Dragons mention that the protagonist has to go to the human world because he has already become an adult. But even regardless of this situation, the protagonist cannot do this. Mother said that everything would be fine, and it was time for him to set out on his own journey. He decides to hand the protagonist a briefcase that was stolen by a god, and his father hands him a special sword. Turns around, asking if he should go. His parents say that it was obvious that he should. He cries, wondering if he could stay, and his parents answer no. Starts to cry. The protagonist decides to do something. Asks his parents to wait a moment. Planned to give them something he made with great care, which was the scarf. That was all he could offer them. Then the protagonist thanks for having been raised by dragons. The dragons begin to get emotional. Our protagonist was a very wonderful child. However, his father says that kindness is not everything. For strong, thieving, and also scary. Father says that the protagonist will one day be able to challenge someone who is as evil as humans and dragons. Father's challenge to the protagonist was that he would become a great man, and our hero would try to make the best of it. Then the protagonist goes to the exit of the mountain. Dragons bid farewell to the protagonist and say that he should visit them from time to time. Father asks how long it will take for him to fix his lack of confidence, but there was no answer. Mother wonders if he will be able to survive alone, even while he is thinking about things. But the protagonist's father was thoughtful and worried. The lady asks if he really has to go. Falls from a very high mountain. Still scared and crying a lot. Falls to the ground, an explosion happens. But he looks up, checking where he was. It was a forest that had many trees cut down. Possibly the monster had passed through there. He didn't know what to do because he was scared, but then someone appears behind him, going to look back and realize that they were many scary monsters. This makes him cry even more. Of this, the monsters start attacking the protagonist, and he dodges the attacks. Finn manages to jump over the huge snake that was there, so past the minotaur that was almost attacking the protagonist. Thor's attack goes with full force, but the protagonist ends up holding that blow, wondering if the monsters had appeared to see him. At that moment, the monsters were frightened. Protagonist says he has to go, so he will say goodbye to them. Ends up hitting some stones and lifting everything with the dragon's magic language. Eyes glowed intensely like blue. Fiddle of this, the protagonist's mother was talking to his father not to worry so much. Then he uses the earth dragon's arm as an attack. Strength of that child is about to appear, so he created two huge walls of arms to catch all the monsters. He was very excited, so he hugs everyone at once because he was nervous and scared. Thor tries to grab the protagonist with everything. Great difficulty, he ends up succeeding. The protagonist confuses this as if the minotaur were trying to congratulate the protagonist. Monsters end up moving away from him, so again, he hugs everyone very tightly, thanking them for everything. After a while, he wonders what happened to the monsters. In fact, they had all lost their lives and fell to the ground. But in the protagonist's view, everyone was sleeping very well, and as soon as he looks back, he sees two small monsters that were trembling with fear. Thor raises his hand, because there was still some kind of life. So the protagonist approaches the children asking if they are okay with a scary face. It is at this moment that the Minotaur rises to jump on top of the protagonist. Ran with all the strength he had inside his body. Made our hero think a little and look around. The Minotaur was looking directly into our hero's eyes. And so the protagonist understood something. Being alone was very bad, but soon someone could take care of him. Our protagonist's father told him to find a strong strong human. So that's how the protagonist runs away. Or, not understanding anything, stays far away just observing the situation. Meanwhile, the protagonist realizes what he should do. For what he was thinking in his head could really work. Since he was ready, it was time to do some research, so that he would become a much stronger man. Goal now is to become a very strong man. He made up his mind as he smiled upward. But in fact, he aimed to find a stronger human being to take care of him. Forward. Wondering if the human world was that way. Since he sees a huge, very well-built city, he decides to run by the water, asking the human to wait for him. The distance, in a place much farther away, inside a cave where lava flowed. There. Tired of what was happening. She says it was very late at that time. After a while, the protagonist manages to step on the ground, and he observes the human beings who were there around him. That was the human world he had heard so much about. Confidently, he walks around. Till he worries about something. He didn't know he was a very strong human being. Head, it was just a shirtless, muscular human. Someone catches the protagonist's attention, for she realizes he was lost. The lady asks if the protagonist was working. Fact, he was just lost out there. Soon the protagonist ends up making a huge noise. The lady wonders if the protagonist was a traveler. She would give him some things in exchange for 3 copper coins, the bread that the protagonist loved so much, and he says he would take it. The lady gets ready to take the money. So the protagonist hands over a lot of gold coins and asks if it was enough. Fused lady wouldn't know what to do, because those were gold coins. Soon the protagonist ended up taking almost the entire municipal market. Wondering what else he should eat, he bumps into someone. Protagonist apologizes. When the men turn around, asking what's going on with the boy, because he seems to be fine. Ask why the protagonist doesn't give them some food. Nor notices something confusing. People seemed like something he had no doubt about. They told the protagonist that he got involved with the wrong gang. Also seemed scary to the protagonist. The protagonist realizes that they are warriors. Then there must be one thing. Men seem to be very strong. Because of this, the protagonist decides to ask if they don't want to take care of him. A piece of wheat ends up passing in front of his nostrils, causes him to sneeze. Sneeze was very strong, to the point of throwing everyone around him far away. Thieves end up hitting their backs on the ground at a far distance. Wonder what it was that he did. So they get ready with swords and ask if that was magic, and they were going to end Norn's life. Frightened, Norn starts to cry as the thieves advance towards him. When the image of his father ends up appearing in Norn's head, asking him to protect himself. Still with his eyes closed, he was up conjuring spells to protect himself. But at that moment, Norn hears a strange voice and notices something cold. He ends up opening his eyes, realizes that everything around him was completely frozen. Because of this, he ends up impressing himself, since he managed to protect himself alone against those bandits. Now doesn't know how to fix this mess. Woman appears, saying it was just as she thought, for the protagonist was not touched by the ice. Thorn gets confused and asks what was happening. Woman soon ends up melting all the ice, and the thieves ask what happened. Realizing that a girl was there, they end up taking their swords. They advance towards her without mercy, for she was much faster with her own sword, and it ended up being a quick movement, aiming directly at these men's faces. The protagonist stands still, for it was very incredible to see that in front of him. She simply asks them to be quiet. Otherwise, they sleep forever. The thief who accompanied the man in the red coat asked him to stop for a moment. That person who was in front of them was the dragon hunting princess named Tiltiu. The thieves start to get desperate because the woman was there. The protagonist realizes that that girl was a very strong person, apologize and soon run away. But something ends up impressing the protagonist. Realizing this, Tiltiu ends up looking at our hero. Ends up bowing, thanking her a lot for her help. She says she didn't help the protagonist, but rather those thieves because they really were in danger. Confused, Norn didn't know what to say. Ends up catching Tiltiu's attention, who realized that the protagonist was strange. Protagonist notices that someone had caught Tiltiu's attention while he was just listening to them talking. In the middle of this, the protagonist joins the conversation, asking who they are. Who had appeared asks if he doesn't know who they are. Then they decide to introduce themselves as the Silver Wing Knights, who known as dragon hunters, those who end all dragons. The protagonist, upon hearing this title, realizes that they were the ones who hurt his father. But it was too late because they need to leave, and the two end up running. The protagonist holds onto them and asks them to wait a moment. Finn asks if the protagonist is in love with the girl. Furo was just making a request down, asking her if he could do something for her. And he ends up crying a little. The man who was beside him asked him to stop, because it wasn't something that was in his league. Even so, he holds himself back a little. But then he asks if she could take care of him and make him grow strong. This actually ends up making everyone very confused. While all this was happening, someone was watching everything, trading to be ill-intentioned, still holding the girl, asking her to take care of him. Silence hung between them. The man who was there ends up holding himself back a lot, laughing a lot at the protagonist's face. Thinking what he had said, says that men have to be strong to survive alone. And he asks the girl if that's what women like most, but she didn't know how to answer. Then the man approaches Norn and tells him to run and get strong. Norn wanted to get close to them. Have to become a dragon hunter. Norn realizes something. That to be taken care of by a strong human, he would also need to be strong to be useful. Quite embarrassed by this, and tries to talk to them a little more, saying that he would become very strong. But in the middle of this, he feels something strange around his body. All of that ends up surrounding everyone. The protagonist realizes that it was the smell of a dragon. Soon he asks the girl to be careful because there was someone behind her. He jumps behind Tiltiu to try to save her. She ends up making a square with her hands, and that creates a protection around them. They disappear from the city. The protagonist's suitcase is left on the ground. While they were in the sky with that protection around them, girl was still progressing with her spells. She asks if the protagonist was okay, which was obviously yes. Realizes that she was casting spells everywhere. 3 air barriers too, that is, that person was very strong. However, the dragon realized that all of that was useless, and the protagonist just observed the whole situation. A human who was turning into a dragon. Asura realizes that the human form was not enough. Transforms into a dragon completely. Everyone just watches. Dragon, now transformed, was immense, and the man holds the protagonist to protect him. Realizing that situation, Norn notes that it was a novice dragon. The man asks what kind of novice dragon was that. Dragon attacks them with bursts of fire explosions, and everyone dodges. Explosions start to happen while they are flying through the air. After that, the man just runs with the protagonist from one side to the other. Dragon wonders how long they will keep running. When the man stops and questions what that monster was doing there. Confused, the dragon ends up laughing, there to seek revenge. For that woman had ended the lives of all his companions. Tiltiu just observed that situation. So the dragon creates a ball of energy to attack directly at her. Releases the energy, the whole ground starts to break. She jumps up, dodging that attack, saying that the cycle of hatred would end there, while the protagonist just watches her fighting, realizing that that was a conflict between humans and dragons. If humans are not stronger than dragons, and that's why the dragon was aiming at the child. Protagonist escapes from the man's arms and runs away. At that moment, he knew it was time to prove that he was strong enough, then activates his dragon powers. Asura notices all the powerful energy he is emanating, while the woman remains focused. Silently, Dragon tries to attack her with everything he has. Sword advances, defending her from all blows. She curses the dragon while fighting, leaves the monster completely disoriented during the attack. Dragon advances to attack her, happy because he was horrible. When the attack approaches her body, Dragon is completely sliced. Head falls to the ground as his body crumbles. Feels nothing while doing all this. Praises her, calling her wonderful and worthy of a princess. Then he asks the protagonist if he managed to see the strength of the dragon hunters. The dragon's head lying on the ground was still alive. Asks the protagonist to stay behind them, explaining that that was the dragon's core. But our hero doesn't listen and moves forward. Tries to hold him by the shoulder, but realizes that it was useless. Asks what the protagonist is doing. Protagonist's aura was intense, similar to that of a dragon. Approaches the head lying on the ground. Asura falls silent. The dragon was very scared at that moment, when he recognized that power that he saw before him. Protagonist stretches his fingers, releasing the fire that was inside his body. The monster realizes that the protagonist is the son of the strongest dragon in the world. It is at this moment that the dragon asks the protagonist to lend him that power. But when the protagonist touches the head, dragon feels something good. Instant energy charges in the protagonist's hand. Slaps the dragon hard, completely lost, not understanding what was happening. The man beside her also didn't know what to do. Dragon was confused, with no reaction to that. The protagonist says that everything the monster was doing was wrong, and that everyone should protect the weakest. States that he could not forgive the dragon for its actions and decides to use his power. The dragon begs him not to do that. Protagonist uses the magic language of dragons. Lightning bolt falls from the sky, while the protagonist sends the dragon back to the sky. Asura's head flies high up to the clouds, taken to the aerial prison. The dragon guardians attack the head and imprison it for all eternity. Dragon is scared because humans shouldn't use dragon spells. Says that the dragon lord would never allow such a thing. The protagonist states that his grandfather will take care of the whole situation. Fu approaches Norn, asking what he did. Tries to explain, but realizes that maybe he shouldn't have done that. Pearl asks how he managed to use all those spells. Before he can answer, the ground of the barriers begins to break, starts to fall. That was terrible to happen right now. The protagonist realizes that the situation was horrible. Hugs Tiltiu, while the man is also falling. Of this, the girl uses levitation magic. Everyone starts to levitate before hitting the ground. The man realizes that he almost kissed the ground. Before he could finish speaking, he ends up falling and actually kissing the ground. Hurt and asks why that happened. Protagonist apologizes, while someone ends up throwing water on them. It was a woman who was passing by. Protagonist is happy that Tiltiu didn't get wet. He was observing something bizarre. As she stood up, she noticed something strange. The protagonist was caught using a magic that he shouldn't. Because of this situation, the man ends up scolding the protagonist about something completely useless, saying that men don't hug, they just receive hugs, while the girl wonders who that boy is. He approaches, asking his name, and so he introduces himself as Norn. Look was strange. Besides confused, it was kind of bizarre. The man just explains that she had an interest in him. Didn't know why the interest. And then he returns the look a little confused. He didn't know what he should do at that moment. Then he ends up releasing his request that he would become a stronger dragon hunter than her. Says that Tiltiu is literally the strongest of all, and there is no way to be stronger than her. Confused protagonist asks how all this happened. Obvious that Norn didn't know all of this. Then he decides to explain about the dragon ranking. Low-level dragons advance in stage. There are dragons that are stronger. So the true dragons that are the strongest of all, considered true natural disasters. That girl was literally the only one who managed to defeat a real dragon. She is literally the strongest of all. There is no way to be stronger than her. Confused because that girl was stronger than his father and mother, continues to scold the protagonist. When Tiltiu approaches, telling him to visit the Adventurers Guild first, she approached in a form of interest in him. Put her hand on the boy's face, saying that she would see him later. Because of this, the protagonist did not understand the situation. But he just got nervous at that moment. And then he confirms that everything is fine, picks up his suitcase that was on the ground, and decides to run to the Adventurers Guild. The man realizes that he would become nothing but stronger than a fly. But the protagonist promises that he would become strong enough to be worth taking care of. Join the Adventurers Guild and become a dragon hunter. From somewhere else the fire was burning high, making meat with a sword. A man who had noticed the smell of a real dragon throws the meat up and sheathes his sword. Decides to check what was happening. While he eats the meat, he says that the presence was very strong. The protagonist ran as fast as he could to the Adventurers Guild. By everywhere, leaving a huge trail of smoke. Extremely determined, till he notices a strange building and decides to investigate what was happening. A huge dragon that was being used as decoration, possibly the Adventurers Guild. He comes with everything and opens the doors, saying that he wanted to become a dragon hunter. When he enters, he sees something that was not so good. A man who was as he came into the world while smoking soon approaches the protagonist, asking if he wants to become a dragon hunter. Then another man appears, saying that children should stay at home. Thus, the protagonist ends up coughing because of the smoke. Smell was horrible for the protagonist. Ends up almost vomiting at that moment. Human beings smell very bad. The man asks if the protagonist is listening. Then soon he ends up getting nervous at that moment, throwing everything on top of them. When the protagonist realizes that he would have to clean all that very quickly. Second, he ends up opening his briefcase, taking a spell that he uses to clean things. In the next second, he cleans that gentleman's face, straight to an extraordinary beauty. Cleaned both of them at once in 3 seconds. Fourth, he observes them from afar, impressed with the protagonist's magic. Our hero apologizes for all the trouble. He decides to proceed to the Adventurers Guild. Someone watches him from afar. Protagonist goes to the reception to register and ends up being stopped by the receptionist. He says he is aiming to become a dragon hunter. That ends up catching people's attention, more when the protagonist wanted to become like Tiltiu. A man ends up laughing at that situation, and that ends up gathering almost everyone. And everyone started to burst into laughter when the protagonist said that he would become a dragon hunter. Receptionist said it was good to have dreams. First, he had to become an adventurer, increase his level. Then, could he become a dragon hunter? Then he asks if he has to become an adventurer. She asks if that's what he decides to do. He ends up handing him a contract, and the protagonist is going to sign that a little further away. But a man ends up stopping the protagonist, saying that at that moment he should hold himself back a little because he wanted to become a dragon hunter. In that case, the man could help him, but in an easy way, only to become his disciple, as the protagonist would become a dragon hunter. That guy's name was Gurud, and everyone knew him. That giant sword he had had a huge physique, seemed very powerful in the eyes of the protagonist. Could only mean one thing, that becoming his disciple was to follow to the Dragon Guild. Protagonist is happy about this, so he ends up asking to be accepted as a disciple, and the receptionist says that she is sure that Gurud is a dragon hunter. However, he has been inactive for a long time. That is, the man says that he is so strong that he doesn't even need to work. Protagonist ends up feeling much more excited about all this, more when he decides to do a demonstration. Throws a stone into the air. So high, really, just one move. Sword ends up cutting that stone in the middle, and the protagonist ends up being surprised even by the precision of that man. Receptionist realizes that it was a trick, but the protagonist was not realizing it. The man asks if he could become the protagonist's boss. Obvious that he could in the easiest way possible. While the protagonist was having fun back and forth, he was thinking about something evil. The weapons that the protagonist had that could be worth a lot of money. That if the protagonist can't pay for all the training, he can receive those weapons as payment and sell everything for a lot of money. Receptionist calls that adventurer who will help the protagonist, hands him a huge paperwork. If he doesn't hunt a dragon in a week, he will lose his credentials. Then the man asked why all this was happening. So he calls the boy, saying that that was horrible. They have to hunt a dragon in a week. Little time for him to even find a dragon, and the receptionist says that that was an intense shame. But the man notices something that was appearing between the lines. Receptionist was talking about a place where there were many dragons. A zombie valley also in a neighborhood nearby. City was taken over by the dragon shadows, and now they were connected. Of course, he is too strong to handle that case, so it was time to proceed with that. The protagonist ends up going down to follow along with him, but the man puts the protagonist in front to take the reins. Warns that the protagonist will go with everything, and that's what makes our protagonist more tense. Go out at night, and the protagonist ends up talking about why he wants to become a dragon hunter. But in the middle of this, he realizes that he couldn't simply go around telling everyone that. Then he says that he is weak and that he wants to become as strong as Tiltu. That's when the man realizes that the protagonist was lying, thinks that maybe Gurud has the magic eye that can see everything. But he says that it was not necessary to tell the whole situation. And the protagonist realizes that his heart was like the ocean. Wonders if that was being a real man. The protagonist asks if they're going to run straight to the city, but the gentleman says that there was no need for concern. They will at least start a strategy. The protagonist gets excited because this strategy would be done at his house. For a while, they end up arriving. Protagonist ends up confusing that huge mansion, but in fact, it was a small house that was right there on the side. Inside that place, it was all rotten and messy. The protagonist asks if it wasn't the mansion next door. Food says that a man is not defined by money. From now on, he will give the first lesson to the protagonist. Firo is confused and really tries to understand what he is going to do. First, he needs to clean that whole place. 5 milliseconds, the protagonist manages to do it. For a while, the gentleman asks him to get the food. 12 milliseconds, he gets all the food possible. The gentleman ends up noticing something strange about this, so he asks the protagonist to jump a little. Protagonist takes a big leap, so flies away at 100,000 meters high. Leaves Gurud astonished with that situation. So the protagonist poses again, ends up asking how he got out. The gentleman doesn't know how to answer for sure, and ends up taking the cigar, but he can't even finish his cigar. If the protagonist came from very far away, he explains that he came from a remote island in the east called Golgotha. Leaves Gurud shocked. The man realizes that this island was not something to be played with, and the protagonist explains that dragons are their relatives. The man understood he was too scared, but he should remain calm. It was the strongest dragon that was there with him, and that sword was identical to Excalibur that was with the protagonist. But wait, he should realize that that was a chance. Have the protagonist to hunt dragons at will. Then he says that the protagonist didn't train the jump enough. Hero falls for it, asking if he didn't train enough. Protagonist ended up giving an attack on a small mouse. Realized that he needs to control his strength a lot. Protagonist asks to be trained, and so the gentleman ends up saying that he would take advantage of it. Use the protagonist to hunt. He would earn a lot of money. Feels bad at that moment. Or else, someone was asking for mercy, but a man doesn't make that easy. A loan shark who was collecting his debts. Because of this, he removes his victim's heart as payment, stores the fresh organs that he always extracted in a magical compartment filled with other hearts. But he wouldn't end that boy's life there. So the loan shark ends up putting his hand on the boy's chest. So he does a magic because now he has less debt and more organs. Starts to scream like all the people who were screaming in pain. He already seemed well at that moment. It was time to proceed. They should hunt a child because they would earn a fortune in money. And now they all should stand up. They needed money, so they would do anything. While the man was smiling at that moment. While Gert tries to stop the protagonist from eating more, for he was eating a lot. Fruit, on the other hand, couldn't believe how much this boy was eating, just that the food from the human world was very delicious. The gentleman notices the protagonist's stomach to be infinite. Then at that moment, someone ended up knocking on the door. This catches the attention of the man who was confused at that moment. Person keeps knocking on the door, increasingly scary. Protagonist was watching, wondering what could have happened, while Gurud also didn't understand very well. Soon the protagonist approaches the door, asking if they could be customers, while Gurud shouts that it could be something dangerous. Someone ends up stealing the door, asking for Gurud. Gentleman who arrived looked for Gurud because it was time to pay the debts. So heard a rumor that he was apparently training a child. Then they realize that the child was under the door. That's when they hold the protagonist and say that they really earned some money, and start to shake our hero from side to side. The protagonist realizes that human beings are obsessed with money, throws the protagonist and realizes that he has nothing. Soon the gentleman asks if the protagonist has something to return. Says that those guys owe a huge amount, that they are corrupt people, and that the protagonist should try to help. The protagonist realizes that they are terrible people. The gentleman decides to use the protagonist for an attack. But at that moment, when he tells the protagonist to attack, our hero didn't know what to do. Wouldn't be able to handle such strong people. But the gentleman says that the protagonist will be fine. Then they end up leaving the protagonist to attack. The gentleman realizes that something strange was about to happen. Who were with the swords end up advancing towards the protagonist. Mercy, they ask for the money. Soon the protagonist realizes that he shouldn't attack so soon. Then he wonders what he should do at that moment. The teaching that he should control his strength fuses the power of the fury of the sky dragon. So those gentlemen who were attacking the protagonist feel as if a dragon were going to attack them. They're all paralyzed at that moment. But when they look back to check the third one who was lost, they realize that he was no longer there. At that place, the protagonist sees a hole in the wall and asks his master if he did well, who answers that the man had not lost his life. He was still moving. Then the gentleman says that the protagonist did very well. And now he was going to proceed to continue with that, while the man outside screams in pain. But after that, the protagonist ends up sneezing, and soon the gentleman thanks the protagonist because he ended up with the three of them. First time, the protagonist felt happy, felt very good. Soon he realized that he was getting stronger and stronger. But at that moment, now the gentleman says that it was time to clean up that whole situation. A guy who was lying on the ground asks for the money to be returned. Otherwise, that person would end him. Gurud wasn't paying attention to that. And that's how Gurud looks at the protagonist confused. Protagonist decides to give the boy who was on the ground some money. Astonished by that, because at that time he should end all debts. Pay the debts, he could get excited. Seeing that money, he wouldn't have many worries, and thus use that to support the family. Buy food and toys with that money. That's how the protagonist understands the situation. Fan looks up, startled, for the protagonist just realized something. Can buy love with money. Gurud was startled. The gentleman who was on the ground, too. At that moment, he felt a full emptiness. Turns the money to the protagonist. Said he couldn't let his son see him that way. Very wonderful. Supporting a family was really difficult according to the protagonist. While Gurud simply says that money was important. Protagonist noticed that Gurud had a complex face. Then he told Norn that it wasn't over yet. Guys had a completely confused boss. Justice ran in Gurud's veins. As much as his boss is complicated, it was time to end him. Fruit and Norn were prepared for this. Gurud was just thinking about his debt being cleared. So we arrive with our protagonist and Gurud at a location. The lone shark's Hediat. At that moment, in front of the gate, they were silent. But they screamed because of the story of the gate. On the inside, there are a lot of people who collect the debt, and they notice the protagonist. Protagonist's name was marked as he has a lot of money. So they run after our hero with everything. Seems that now he would have to solve his own problems. So he proceeds with that. Realizes that the situation could be calm for him. Frood says it's not that easy. He should continue while he was under attack. Starts to use his power. Smoke passes through his hands with the tongue of the magic dragon. Same thing happens with his feet. Face is dominated by an interesting magic. Follows the magical power of the dragon. Starts to bind the bodies of the people because it was a technique followed by the subordinates. Twin would proceed with that. So all those who tried to attack the protagonist would be useless. But he jumps over the attacks. Everything, throwing smoke on top of the people. Holding himself well, he is praised by Gurud. Someone appears, a muscular woman. Fists were made of dragon hair. Soon he is challenged to a fight. She also ends up losing. Makes the protagonist feel that he is not controlling his power very well. But even though people advance towards him, so gently the protagonist manages to finish them off. The winds as if it were nothing. So he uses the wind to attack again, throwing them all up. The protagonist realizes that gently he can move on. But his vision was getting very blurry, and that didn't seem to be very good. Were getting horrible for him. But in the middle of this, an explosion happens. The protagonist falls to the ground. There was a limit to his power, and that hurt a lot. His stomach was hurting a lot. Maybe it's because he ate a lot before coming here. Asks what happened to the protagonist. He explains that it was his stomach. But in the middle of this, someone was approaching the protagonist and Gurud. This ends up catching the attention of both of them. And in the distance was there observing everyone. Finally introduces himself as Galatea, the man who collects the debts. Smiles at the people who were there to pay the debt. Food, but Gurud says no, because it was something that couldn't be done now. Fia was just doing his job as well as the contract and got irritated with Gurud. Protagonist keeps an eye on Galatea. His smell was strange but familiar. Mentally, Galatea ends up picking up his subordinates because they were fallen. Philea tries to heal his subordinate who was lying on the ground. Like the others, he proceeds by putting his hand on top of them, one by one, making purple lightning come out of each one's body. Vrud says that seems interesting. However, the protagonist was realizing that something was different. Felt an immense pain. Protagonist apologizes for interrupting. He runs off to the bathroom while Galatea talks about lending money. People are lying on the ground, so Galatea lends his power to his subordinates while Gurud watches. His eyes were incredulous at what was happening. They were rising again while screaming in pain, so they ran after the protagonist. And Galatea in the background watched while laughing. Galatea's subordinates were crying because everything was hurting. While Gurud watched this, shouting for the protagonist, ends up saying that he trusts his master. Meanwhile, everyone jumps on top of Gurud. Galatea says that they were all useless. Farud saw that whole situation, and so the protagonist jumped to try to help. According to Galatea, humans are very useful. Scream as they run towards Gurud. By himself, the gentleman was defending with his giant sword. Meanwhile, Norn was with his stomach aching and couldn't fight. He could support Gurud. Feels an intense aura. All the liquid on the ground begins to be stepped on by the crazy people. Jump towards Gurud, but all of them begin to be sucked in little by little. This is because of a unique power of the protagonist. They end up wondering what all that was happening. Now he could do what he wanted. Raises his hand, giving a thumbs up to the sky. Same thing does Gurud. Time to continue the fight against Galatea. Galatea holds his subordinates, realizing that the protagonist's magic was from a dragon. Thanks for being saved from that spell. But that wasn't what Galatea was doing this for. So he ends up using the subordinate as a weapon. Fight against Gurud. Confused, not understanding what was happening. Because of this, Gurud got irritated and asked what he was trying to do with that man. Then Galatea continues attacking with the body of his subordinate, until attacking with everything on Gurud. Fenelman ends up dodging that blow with everything. More other blows come in his direction. Because of this, the man ends up falling to the ground, and Galatea appears right behind to try to help. Ends up throwing him even harder. Till Gurud uses his sword to defend that blow. He wasn't going to stop doing all that alone. He asks for help from the protagonist. Because if Gurud were caught by that guy, terrible things could happen there. A dragon hunter and couldn't simply lose so easily. That is, he has to hunt a dragon at that moment. Soon an explosion happens. Subordinate gets stuck in the ground. Galatea says that all that was very difficult. Then he decides to take another disciple. Leaves Galatea completely irritated. And he manages to find an escape route there in the middle. He decides to run for his life, while the other people scream for help. But these people were not worth saving. But at that moment, Galatea had thrown one of his subordinates again. Is thinking about trying to dodge that. But that guy keeps approaching him, getting closer and closer. Frood manages to dodge for a while. Top of that, he saves that man, happy to be alive at that moment. Because of this, he ends up thanking Gurud, and many times while Gurud ends up leaving that place, because he could still fight a little more. Uses his sword to the sky trembling, thrusts it into the ground. A power of a dragon hunter. Protagonist is watching from afar, feels his stomach have a different situation. Galatea, looking at the situation, starts to laugh non-stop. Gurud's power did nothing. Fia asks if he is understanding the situation. Hunting a dragon was useless at that moment, so Galatea decided to sell them. For after cutting all of them in the middle, Fia advances towards everyone very irritated. The protagonist on his own was approaching. Gurud was lost at that moment, approaches in front of him and prepares for an intense punch. And hitting Galatea with everything in the base of his stomach makes Galatea get lost in that intense pain he was feeling. Protagonist master was very incredible at that moment, and his stomach had also happened something. Protagonist's stomach was no longer hurting. Protagonist looks at the whole situation. The wall that was in front of him had completely broken, and he no longer understood what he would have to do at that moment. Phil appears distant, climbing the obstacles with everything, using that language of dragon magic, cause an intense explosion inside him. The protagonist realizes that all that was horrible. Fia uses the lizard eyes. People start to turn into stones, one after the other without stopping. Protagonist's feet start to petrify. Scares him for a while. Bird eyes start to cause much more danger to the people. The protagonist had already understood the situation. Smell of the dragon comes directly from Galatea. Because of this, the protagonist was noticing something strange and decides to call his master. Looks, his eyes start to widen intensely. Master at that moment had turned into stone. He probably did all this on purpose because he didn't want to fight. The protagonist starts to cry. Before he could finish, he ends up taking a blow, so he falls to the ground. As if that attack was nothing, Fia was irritated because the boy used the dragon's language. Everyone around was scared because Galatea looked like a dragon. That guy looks at all his subordinates as if they were garbage, and he just attacks, breaking the arms and legs of those who have already turned into stone. For a while, the protagonist was there. Galatea thanks a lot for everyone's hard work, and that's when the protagonist asks if they aren't his friends. Tia replies that it was obvious that not. Fra said that everything he read in fictional stories was false. No way he could have created affection for a horrible species. Protagonist is silenced for a while. Soon he starts to get up, understanding the situation. Galatea jumps on top of the protagonist, talks about a story of a child who was raised by dragons. While he punches the protagonist's face, while our hero ends up remembering his parents, for Galatea had cursed them. According to Galatea, the protagonist's parents only saw him as a pet. It was obvious that this was a lie. His mother really loved him as a son. Of this, Galatea continues trying to give several attacks to the protagonist, while our hero remembers his own father. So Galatea prepares for a final attack. He jumps with everything to attack, hits the protagonist squarely, leaves our hero completely lost. Galatea thought that at the moment he was going to have an interesting fight, but that whole moment is silent, and Galatea prepares to give the final attack to the protagonist. Because of this, he advances with everything, making several attacks, ready to hit his attack. But our hero holds that punch as if it were nothing. Galatea to be quiet at that moment. Galatea's last vision was of a punch coming towards him. He doesn't understand what this boy is. He's up taking a powerful punch, making him be thrown at high speed by the impact. The air pressure generated by the punch destroys everything in the way, while Galatea continues to be thrown, till being stopped by something. Realizes it's a magic barrier, completely slowed down. Thrown again by the barrier, like a slingshot firing a stone. Philo realized that he should defend himself at that moment, while the protagonist prepares for another blow, saying that his parents are not a joke. So he prepares for the punch. Glow intensely. Then he gives another punch with everything on Galatea. Falls to the ground, unable to move properly. Ended up realizing that his armor was broken in half. Because of this, the protagonist was still approaching because he hadn't finished. Grabs Galatea's face hard. Repeats that he is the son of the dark dragons, when Galatea is going to say that the protagonist is a pet. He ends up taking such a deep punch to the face that an explosion happens. Head had been destroyed. The remaining body tried to punch the protagonist, swinging him away with everything and creating a huge explosion. Ended up throwing the protagonist to the skies. Fly to attack again. Head regenerates little by little, and the brightness of his eyes left the protagonist's vision blurred, and it ended up turning him into stone. Frio was irritated with the protagonist. Just let him fall. Meanwhile, he heard that in fact he was just a pet. The protagonist was already irritated at that moment, and his statue began to break little by little. Galatea just humiliated the protagonist, while he really thought that he could just be a pet, remembering moments with his parents. But the protagonist remembers his memories of sleeping with his mother. Soon these memories begin to outweigh all the bad things. Statue begins to break into thousands of pieces. That unbreakable stone begins to shatter until it falls to the ground and breaks. Because of this, Galatea realizes that the protagonist was just an unnecessary person. But something happens that leaves Galatea confused. The protagonist, who was intact at that moment, falls to the ground safe and sound. Fills his wings with everything. The language of dragons to use wind spells. Protagonist's foot jumped as fast as possible, so it made him approach Galatea to give a full attack on him. Freya screamed in pain at that moment. For the protagonist, his family was the most important thing in the world. Galatea did not accept this factor. Tells the protagonist to stop all this. He advances towards the protagonist. His bloodline was perfect, but he was abandoned by his family. Never had relatives or even friends. The protagonist realizes what he was trying to say. Small among the stone dragons. Because of that, he was left behind. Species abandoned him. But at that moment, he realized something very important and would never betray Galatea. He had money. He would have people to accompany him. Fame, subordinate, and everything he wanted. Because of that, he laughed, and the protagonist realized that Galatea was alone all the time. Decided to help him one last time, while Galatea used the power of the dragon's arms. And so that strength was supernatural enough to end everyone who was around. On that beautiful night, Galatea tried to punch the protagonist. Fist came closer and closer. However, our hero moved away quickly, left Galatea surprised. For at that distance, you could see something on his face, a tear that ran from the depths of his being. Protagonist's innocence was an important key. Galatea stopped at that moment. Soon he continued asking why the protagonist was crying. But it was because Galatea suffered a lot at that moment, made an important decision in his life. Fizz his arms to Galatea as he continued his attack. The protagonist says that he would take care of him now. Galatea thought it was all absurd. Impossible for him to take care of a dragon, hitting the blow, generating a great explosion with shockwaves. Galatea recovers from the impact, gives another attack on the protagonist. Form once again stands in front of Galatea, still, while Galatea continued to attack him over and over again, telling him to stop it. For Galatea didn't need anyone's love. Fia continued to attack, over and over again without stopping. Tears started to come out of his eyes as he asked the protagonist to stop feeling sorry for him. Activated his earth arms. Holding Galatea's punch, he pulled that human being hard to give him a hug. Though he looked up, Fia was silent, and the protagonist says he feels sorry for him. Something that can't be helped. After all, he had no relatives to take care of him. That's why the protagonist would be his father, and from now on he would take care of him. Galatea didn't understand what the protagonist was saying, so he started to cry because Norn was going to start taking care of him. However, Galatea ended up getting up, felt at that moment if we're lying on a delicious blanket. Because of this, he ended up exploding in the sky. From there, he ended up demonstrating a form. The protagonist realized that it was that form of a family contract. Galatea asked if the protagonist was really going to do that. Galatea could really become a familiar to Norn. Smile, Norn confirms. Because of this, he ended up crying because it was true that he could. So he jumped for a hug. Problem that Galatea caused would be taken out. The people who turned to stone were no longer stone. People who lost their arms had their arms grown back. Who were near the end of their lives were saved. And the protagonist's master was returning to being a normal person. Of this, he opened his eyes completely. The last thing he saw was the protagonist standing before him, asking if he had seen everything, still trying to process everything, and his mind froze. That moment, he didn't know what to say. Because of this, he simply accepted what the protagonist said. Now time to head back so they could eat. We got home. The protagonist ate a lot, leaving the old man unsure of what to do. Felt broken at that moment. Remembered when Galatea wanted to give away all his money to them. The old man had obviously said it wasn't necessary, but the protagonist refused it anyway. Calling this, Gerd began to cry. He watched the protagonist eat so much, he started thinking deeply about the situation. Decided to ask the protagonist where Galatea had gone. Close to everyone when someone started knocking on the door. The person who entered after politely asking for permission caused a massive stir. The protagonist's master appeared bewildered. Comer had her hair tied in a ponytail, a noticeably large chest, a maid under Norn's care. Galatea, now asking to be called Laisha. She was female, though I thought she was a male dragon. Protagonist then asked if she had taken the form of a ghostly dragonkin. Confirmed this, explaining that she appeared much more imposing in a male form. Her real name was Garland Tia Barrett, but she asked to be called Laisha. Felt very embarrassed about calling the protagonist dad, but our hero insisted she use his name instead. Because of this, she revealed that she had something special for the protagonist. He handed over one of her horns. Since he was planning to become a dragon hunter, this served as proof to build his reputation. Protagonist's master was overjoyed by this. Firo gently patted her on the head, making her even more excited. Hugged the protagonist, warming him with her embrace. That it was time to move forward. The protagonist's master took the horn. Far from that scene, in a fortified city, dragon hunters returned victorious. They had hunted a group of adult dragons and returned unharmed. A child nearby exclaimed how amazing and cool they all were. Child approached them and asked if he could become a dragon hunter. Clear that he could at that moment. Dragon magic began emanating from the mysterious man. Told the child that when he grew up, he could become very strong and they would travel together. Because of this, we head to the Adventurers Guild. Everyone seemed utterly confused. The protagonist arrived with his boss Gurud and the maid. The guild members asked if they had enjoyed their adventure. One of the men approached the protagonist, saying he was making small but steady strides. Receptionist welcomed him warmly. She asked Gurud to hand over the dragon hunter license right away. Hesitated for a moment. Soon he presented an enormous, incredibly powerful horn. Sight captured everyone's attention because it came from a stone dragon. So served as proof of subjugation, showing that the two had completed the mission. Adventurers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The protagonist took off that adventurer's clothes. Just continued, as that was the aura of a king. The protagonist's master is just a very wonderful person who completes everything with silence, radiant with happiness. So he ends up telling the protagonist that from that time on they have a lot to do. Dragon materials are used in society for many things and have a very high price. Dragon hunter feels enormous lust, and the protagonist noticed this. Because of this, they go on an intense adventure. But the protagonist sees, in the distance, the two people he most wanted to see at that moment. Tiltiu, who was talking to that gentleman, realizes that if the protagonist has something to say, he should go there and say it. So he ends up throwing the protagonist in there, attracting the attention of the two. The protagonist there and are confused. The embarrassed protagonist says hi to them, notices the distance and what could be happening. So she is quiet for a moment. Soon, they are taken to a tavern. There, the protagonist tries to say what he wants. He gets a parfait. And yes, she says that that was wonderful and also a reward for the protagonist having subjugated a dragon. Because of this, she ends up saying that they will be together now and are probably wonderful. She talks about being a disciple. Soon, the protagonist asks if everything is okay. He says there is no way to stand up to her. But it was obvious that he wanted to be just as strong, and because of that, she ends up looking at the protagonist, turns her gaze. Because at that moment, something was much more important than competition to see who eats faster. Protagonist ends up eating very quickly. So he turned the glass completely, ends up ordering more food. Protagonist begins to devour all the meat served. Tiltiu, who is also eating a lot. Protagonist eats a giant loaf of bread. She eats several small slices. Hero eats a huge fish. She sliced the fish, making sushi, and eating at the same time. Hero eats a lot of pasta and was already getting a little tense. She was perfectly fine, eating various pasta. Viewers who were nearby noticed the boy that Tiltiu brought. A glutton just like her. Because of this, he started to feel a little sick. She smiles at this situation, but ends up giving up on the competition. Protagonist thinks she didn't finish because she was full. She says she was on a diet, and the protagonist notices this and is a little confused. Both give thanks for the food. At the end of that afternoon, they end up sitting down to talk a little. She hands an apple to the protagonist. That's because she lost, and he could ask for anything he wanted. Hero would have to ask for just one thing. Was a little confused when she says that a person who appeared there was her father. Who her father is. She replies that that man who helped the protagonist. Garud Vanguard. He is her father. Protagonist was confused at that moment. Her apple ended up falling, hitting the ground. Already in another place, we see a golden apple, picked up by someone surrounded by dark energy. Footed man, defending people's lives. That wasn't enough for him. See everyone lifeless at that moment. For him, none of this was enough, intensely, destroying everything in his path. That day, the fortified city of Griril was destroyed without any precedent. Soon, we return to the protagonist who was talking to Tiltiu about her father. Explains about Garud being her father. Seems that Garud doesn't know that she is his daughter. Father and mother divorced before she was born. Her mother was also a dragon hunter, strong one. More than that, a kind person. Besides being a very noble person, was the ideal model of a person. One day, she ended up seeing her mother leave. The dragon that was right behind, she ended up taking an attack, stayed alive, and this ended up surprising the protagonist. But when she grew up, she ended up leaving her mother to look for her father. Fully, she ended up finding her father in a short time, a very bad reputation. Soon, she ended up losing the admiration she had for him, so the protagonist could not let bad guy have control over him either. But in the distance, Norn watched her precious companions, and our hero didn't know how to answer. Says that the master was incredible as well as being a very strong person. She asks if the protagonist is not fooled so easily, but that's not it. Time to do a test. She holds a stone to hit her father, who was in that situation. Protagonist says that that is not enough, so he ends up tearing off a piece of the fence. Explains that his magic eye can see everything. The stone or a spear, he could really dodge very easily. She asks if anyone has ever said that the protagonist is insane. Prepares to attack with everything. Foot ends up stepping hard, tried to hold the protagonist, but it was too late. He had already thrown the lance. At that moment, Gerd was still sleeping, with his head resting on one of his hands. When he stretches out the arm that was supporting his head, which makes him dodge the spear at the exact second, throwing his head back. Now I don't know if this was luck or if he is really good. When he wakes up and asks what happened, stands up as the spear flies towards a dragon. Explosion happens, scaring Gerd. He asks what happened while the protagonist explains to her that it was his magic eye. She wonders if he is really that strong, but she can't believe that situation. When the protagonist says that he is going to tell them about their relationship, she stops him, saying she would tell at the right time, while he must keep it a secret. So, elsewhere, they were going on a trip while Garud laughed very loudly. He had gotten a lot of money. So much money that he could stop being a dragon hunter. Another thing came, a dragon that they should defeat. If it were a worm, then he was probably overthinking at that time. Protagonist could take care of that dragon, and he could be quiet at that moment. In the distance, someone seemed to need help. Protagonist noticed the situation, and he asked who was there. An old man who was buried in the ground, and they asked how this happened. The old man ends up being saved by the protagonist, waiting for the hunters to arrive and thanks them for coming. He says that this kind of thing happens normally and that the holes were being dug by the dragon. He ends up showing the hole, and Garud is watching. Garud cannot believe that a dragon would vary this. Old man asks him to look directly at the fields. The entire field was completely full of holes everywhere. Makes Garud impressed with so many holes. Old man says that these things usually appear day after day. The maid draws the protagonist's attention, but he already knew what was happening. Dragon's smell was too strong coming from one of the holes. Press was hidden inside, something they couldn't simply ignore at that moment. The old man says that now it is the protagonist's turn to take care of the situation. Time to put a plan into action to make it all work. A tactical adventure for the protagonist. Then he ends up throwing a bag up high and uses magical dragon language at that moment. The magic of the sky dragon. Fear. He will end up throwing several things into all the holes at once. While the protagonist waits to see if the dragon will come out of all the holes. But where he least expected it, an intense tremor begins. The dragon was really coming out of the hole. Protagonist asks the old man to wait. Something gigantic comes out of that hole. Closer and closer, faster and faster, until it causes a huge tremor. Dragon is close to the exit. Comes out, scaring everyone. Fruid sees that. He asks if that is really serious. Several earthworms being released everywhere. The maid picks up an umbrella while protecting Norn. Protagonist keeps an eye, thinking that it wasn't all that. Fully Garud realized that everything was not right at that moment. Suddenly, a lot of smoke starts to come out of that hole in the ground. The protagonist realized that he was immersed at that moment. Huge dragon called Nozuchi. Fold Man says that it was a very large dragon and asks how they are going to deal with it. Before he could finish speaking, the protagonist was already going all out to kick him in the mouth. Foldman was confused by this. Soon, the protagonist prepares another kick, catching fire. And even though he was in the air, he hits it hard, throwing the dragon to the ground. Foldman looks at Garud and asks what was happening there. Soon as Garud stands up, he says that the protagonist was doing a good job. Dragon begins to speak to the protagonist in an unknown language. Then, he asks his master if he had noticed what was happening. The underground ancestral dragon that lived in an unknown city. True name was Midgard Sormer. Tries to say the dragon's name but can't, although he realizes that it was a true dragon. Exactly what was happening. The true dragon was calling them from the ground. Frood doesn't understand what's going on, but is pulled down hard. Everyone falls into the hole hard. After a long fall, they land on the ground without any problems. Protagonist looks forward, asking what was happening, a place also known as a dungeon. Protagonist is very excited about this. Soon he realizes that this was an adventurer's thing. Flora of that place was very different from the surface. Decided to defeat that dragon and started walking through the corridors. Frood was getting a little tired of all this path. For a while, he was already extremely tired. For hours inside the dungeon. That's when the protagonist realizes that that dungeon was huge and he didn't even know the way, which makes Garud furious. That's when he could smell the real dragon. In that corridor where they were, the smell got stronger and stronger. Soon as the protagonist asks the two to go back, decides to use the dragon's magic again. Releases the breath of the fire dragon in the corridor. The breath went through the corridor, till the end of the corridor. Fire magic hit something. There really was something there, the protagonist was thinking. Because of this, he says that everyone should run to fight that. But after the smoke clears, he realizes what was in front of them. Just a rhinoceros with a huge horn. Drew realizes that normal adventurers wouldn't be able to fight that monster, but the protagonist managed to. So, they continue walking through the corridors. For a while, they realize that something was happening. Tiltiu who was there. Then, they wonder if there is another entrance and where the protagonist came from. But Tiltiu had also taken that whole request to explore the dungeon. Frood puts his hand on her hair and says that it was a good job she did. He releases his hand and says it was nothing. Also comments that it was very strange to see her sweating like that. But the protagonist realized that it was because of their kinship. So he feels a huge dragon magic, extremely powerful magic. Frood was not noticing this whole situation. Keep walking while the protagonist wonders if it was dragon magic. For a while, they enter a huge room. Frood asks if the real dragon was around. For a while, a huge tremor starts to hit everywhere. Here's what was happening at that moment. Soon, they hear a voice telling them to leave or be devoured. The true dragon, and everyone starts to pay attention. The protagonist approaches and says that it has been a long time since they have seen each other. Of this, the dragon ends up saying hi to the protagonist, doesn't understand what's going on, and asks how our hero knows a dragon. Frood couldn't think straight about what was happening. Because of this, the dragon ends up apologizing, says that they had been playing for a long time. She asks the dragon what was happening around there. Implies that he has been attacked a lot by adventurers, but that lately, he was tired. Also said that there was a cut made by someone mysterious. The protagonist asks who this person would be. As soon as Gerd realizes that there was a weapon stuck in the dragon, he decides to ask what that was. Something was draining the dragon's blood. Dragon asks them to remove that because it caused a lot of pain. Because of this, the protagonist decides that it was time to remove that. For now, he makes an intense movement, causing an explosion. Foon was getting deeper and deeper due to the protagonist's sword. He finds a way to get that out. For effort, he manages to remove the spear from inside. The protagonist prepares himself with a potion that his mother gave him, throws the potion on the dragon's wound. The wound begins to heal on its own. People wonder what happened to the spear, a substance at the end of the spear that no one understood what it was. Dragon explains that it was to make an elixir. Fluid was extracted from the spear periodically, and a cut was made in his belly to do this. Frood asks what happened so far, but the dragon is silent for a while. He starts to appear in the background. Was there talking to a boy about the magical power of the spear. Dragon appeared behind, scaring the two. That dragon, a person appeared. Fool, a man who was angry about the things that were happening. Protagonist noticed the situation and started to get tense. Same thing happened with Tiltiu. Because of this, the protagonist asks everyone to go back while that mysterious man throws the dragon's head hard. Ends up scaring the protagonist, making him even more tense. Dragon had lost its life right in front of him. Protagonist did not know what had ended his life at that moment. The pressure in the air was as strong as his own father's. Fia asks the protagonist to run back while advancing to an attack. He uses the dragon's magic. Before she could do anything, her arm is broken. She is thrown back hard. The mysterious person was getting closer and closer to them, feeling a dragon power. But that mysterious man realized that he had left. Protagonist wonders who that person was. That's when Tiltu introduces him as a demon. Without understanding, the staff didn't take it seriously and thought it was a joke. The mysterious man was getting angrier. Steps on the ground. Everything breaks. The deeper he goes, the rocks are broken. Starts hitting the ground because he's so angry. The world to bring back the intense power he was feeling. Finished off the very rare dragon and couldn't just look that person in the eye. Staff got desperate, but the man stopped hitting. Phil, in less than a blink of an eye, he advanced on Tiltu, threw her back without even demonstrating a fraction of his power. We asked not to let her killer tension get too strong. So he looks around. The protagonist attacks him. His punches stopped as if it were nothing. Anger in her eyes, Norn stares at the demon. But he was not caring about that. Moving away, he realizes who the protagonist is. But he also couldn't fight on an empty stomach. So he takes the heart of that dragon that was behind him, eats and devours it as if it were nothing. Protagonist gets angrier and angrier. The man was just tasting that heart. Few draws the protagonist's attention. Before she could say anything, that guy was already completely angry and ready for a new fight. We go back a little in the past with protagonist's father saying something to him. Past, there was an endless conflict between humans and dragons. All this, the demons began to appear. Creatures, strong enough to destroy everything. After a long time, human beings finally achieved peace and made a truce with the dragons to end the demons. After challenging the demons, several dragons and many humans lost their lives. Tension made the dragons and humans come out victorious, and the demons were banished. The protagonist asked about the training. But then we return to the present time where he finally saw a demon. Feeling was different for him. That explosion of power was completely confusing. Farad asks the demon to introduce himself. The demon had no name for the weakest. Farad got extremely angry about this. The protagonist was just impressed with his master, but the demon soon says that he was collecting fluid from the dragon. He looks at the staff. He realizes that they were all very irritating. Because of this, he simply gives everyone a killer look. Stone arm comes out of the ground to attack everyone. Huge and ends up hitting the ground. Few blocks the attack, but the protagonist with great difficulty. Till then, our hero realized that the situation was getting tense. Fruit appears right behind to attack, strikes his sword right in the back of that demon. Stone arm begins to shatter. Few is impressed with this. Protagonist too. Food then says that that was useless to them. Soon as the protagonist realizes that there was nothing he could do with his master, Feeman was walking, completely irritated. Back when he sees Gurud and decides to introduce himself with the name Gazilda. Releases an intense power that flies everywhere. Protagonist notices this power and begins to retreat. Then he tells Gurd that he would be the last to make such a move. So the demon vanishes. Blue-haired boy realized that the demon had left when he tries to check what was happening. Before he could blink, the demon was in front of him to punch him. Protagonist tried to react quickly to try to help. Too late, the punch was thrown, and he went flying into the wall. Soon after, the demon focuses on Tiltiu, and he punches her in the head. She is also thrown as far away as possible. Girl was resistant, so she proceeded to counterattack. She tried to counterattack. The demon simply dodged as if it were nothing. Realized how strong she was. Standing, watching how that demon was insanely strong. Meanwhile, the girls were completely lost at that moment. Haired boy woke up, but an explosion happened around him. Explosion even went up to the surface. Thought he was going to lose his life there. The protagonist was holding his arms, asking if everything was okay. Flew as high as possible to try to help. Starting to get cold, the human body couldn't take it. The protagonist then decides that it was time to go back to try to help. Protagonist became even more worried about everyone. That cave, people were struggling. And the demon realized there was someone very strong there. Tiltiu, who was holding on as if it were nothing. Protagonist's maid was lying on the ground. The last one left was Gurud, who was watching the whole situation. Tiltiu was thrown to the ground as if she were nothing. Forge shone with an intense power, so the power of ice was around her. While the protagonist was flying with all his might, strong as that demon was, the protagonist believed in Tiltiu. Then, he would have to use the sword he got from his father. He decides it was time to use Excalibur.